Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. I'm really excited about this one. Today's episode is about Milton Erickson. It's going to be a critique of Milton Erickson's work, his teachings, his claims, what I perceive to be the strengths and weaknesses of his teachings, his claims, according to me. So it's quite subjective, obviously. Erikson had three careers. He had a career as a researcher, researching psychology, obviously, spending a lot of time researching hypnotic phenomena. He had a long career as a clinician, and for the last decade of his life, he did a lot of teaching. So I'm going to talk as a student. Now, of course, Erikson died in 1980. I was born in 1977, so I never met the guy. I don't have a direct experience of his teachings. My background for this is my 25th year of seeing clients professionally. I have an in-depth background in neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis and various schools of psychotherapy. Um, I have read most of what has been written about and by Milton Erickson for the last 25 years. I've been in this field. I was lucky enough to have John Grinder, the co-founder of neurolinguistic programming, as a kind of informal mentor for many, many years. And I heard a lot from him. He taught me a lot that Milton Erickson had taught him. And Grinder, of course, had the opportunity with Richard Bandler to model Milton Erickson back in the 70s. So I kind of second generation student of Erickson's work. Outside of Grinder as the main source, I've had the chance to attend quite a few seminars with Richard Bandler, who was also obviously a student of Erickson's. Different seminars with Stephen Gilligan, who also was a student, and also to have some conversations with the late Steve Andreas, who also spent a little bit of time with Erikson. So I have access to, or have had access to, some of these first generation students. And I've had the chance to hear some audio recordings and watch a little bit of footage, but not much footage. Unfortunately, there's not that much footage available. So having said all that, let's go into this. The first thing that strikes me with Erikson is that he was a very unique individual and a true innovator. Those of us who work today have the privilege of standing on the shoulders of giants. We have access to people like Erikson and various legends of psychotherapy and meditation and so on and so forth. But Erikson, so consider this. Just the other day, I was listening to a pain psychologist who does a lot of good work, who's teaching at Stanford and doing her best to kind of pioneer a biopsychosocial approach to working with chronic pain. Her name is Rachel Zoffness, relatively young psychologist, seems to be doing very, very good work. And the ironic thing is that when she presents that biopsychosocial approach to working with chronic pain to other medical doctors and psychologists, for the most of them, they haven't been taught anything about that. During their studies, they hardly are taught anything about pain, and the very little that they are taught, usually is just pain as a chronic pain as the result of biochemical factors and stuff like that. There's very little emphasis on that psychological, social aspect of it. Now, what occurred to me as I was hearing Dr. Zoffness speak and just how new what she's presenting in 2022, as I record this, is to medical doctors and psychologists. Everything that she's describing, everything that pain psychologists who are kind of innovative today are doing is something that Milton Erickson did back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. There's virtually nothing that they're teaching that he didn't pioneer back then. And of course, he had a background of struggling with his own polio, so he discovered a lot of this through just experimentation. He really didn't have anyone to teach him. The only other sources I can think of who did similar things are the old meditation masters of the East. And Erikson never talks about those. I kind of doubt that he had access to that back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s in the United States. I could be wrong, but very innovative. Consider this, the use of hypnosis back in the 19 so Erikson went to medical school. He was a medical doctor, psychologist, and psychiatrist. So he went to school in the early 20s. So he was working, from the late 20s, active teaching until he died in 1980. So that's a really, really long career. Now, when he started out in the 20s, and the ironic thing is that hypnosis is kind of the first Western conceptualization of a psychotherapy, right? But when he started in the 20s, psychoanalysis, the work of Sigmund Freud, was the shit, essentially, in psychology. And it was all about understanding people through a psychoanalytic lens. Freud, of course, had rejected hypnosis. So hypnosis was kind of looked down upon. It was a domain of stage hypnotists and stuff like that. Nothing for a serious medical professional to be engaged with. Erikson, at that time in that climate, started doing hypnosis and hypnotic experiments and applying hypnosis with his patients. So that's very innovative for the time. And he did it quite differently. I'll get back to that a bit later in this review. At the time, too, with a psychoanalytic lens, it was all about long-term therapy and insight and childhood. Erikson pioneered brief, present moment, solution-oriented psychotherapy. That was kind of unheard of back in those days. He worked with couples. He worked with families long before it was fashionable to do so. He was directive. He gave clients tasks. He took them out into the real world. He made them do behavioral tasks at a time when that was essentially unheard of. And the way he conceptualized an unconscious mind, the Freudians kind of conceptualized it as this kind of garbage bin, essentially, of the hidden impulses and rage and deep shame and fears and forbidden sexual conflicts, and just this garbage bin of the kind of savage, animalistic parts of the human psyche. Erikson had a way more optimistic, practical, pragmatic way of conceptualizing it, as he conceptualized it as a storehouse of experiential learnings and resources and things we know without quite knowing that we know them, and how you, through hypnosis, could help people to get in touch with that and to aim it at specific contexts and to reorganize one's experience in very artistic ways. Erikson, in many ways, was the opposite of what you could call the stereotypical modern-day bureaucrat, who has clients fill in forms and diagnosis according to the DSM and these standardized interventions. Erikson had a very non-pathological approach to working with people, and one of his big strengths was that he really saw each individual as unique, and he tried to tailor what he did to that particular individual, his or her personality tendencies, values, frameworks, background. So he was able to design very unique interventions and learning contexts to be able to resonate with that particular client. So I'll give you a one of my favorite examples of this. Um, One of Erikson's patients had a daughter who was, I think, 16 years old. And that daughter had gotten convinced that her feet was way too big. And she developed all sorts of fixations and insecurities around the size of her feet, to the point where she no longer left the house and was socially isolated, anxious, and depressed. And the mother asked Erikson to help with this, and Erikson said, "Sure, I'll take care of it." And what Erikson would often do is that he was a genius at devising learning contexts where people could have insights or emotionally corrective experiences or to reframe something. So he set up with the mother that Erikson would come to the mother's house to do a physical examination on the mother for some plausible reason, and that the daughter was supposed to be there to help out as an assistant of sorts. And Erikson did his examination of the mother, and he kind of commanded the young girl around to do various things. And then, as part of the intervention, he kind of stepped backwards and stepped on the daughter's foot really, really hard. And the daughter kind of screamed out, and he had her attention. And Erikson, in that moment, turned at the young girl, looked at her, and said, "If you could only grow those feet large enough for a man to see them, I wouldn't be in this situation," and just kind of dismissed her and went on doing whatever he did with the mother. Now, of course, the implication of this was that she had small feet. And that's the reframe, that's the corrective experiences, that's the shift in perspective that she got. She didn't even know that he was there to do an intervention with her. And before the evening was over, she had made some sort of arrangement with friends to go to a movie, and she restored her social life, and she forgot all about her feet. Now that's one example of a very tailor-made Ericksonian intervention that you couldn't put into like a psychotherapy manual where you say, for this type of client, do this. It was uniquely designed for that particular intervention. He was extremely good at using humor, drama, stories, to kind of hit things home and to utilize things. So, for example, when he worked on the psychiatric wards, he had this patient who was convinced that he was Jesus Christ and kind of acted as he was Jesus Christ. And instead of arguing with him and trying to get him back to consensus reality in the common way, Erikson went up to him and said, I hear that you have experience as a carpenter, which of course Jesus Christ had to agree that he had. And Erikson, gave him all these tasks as a carpenter, where he got really constructive and productive and got a sense of significance and got to connect with people. And over time, that helped that particular person orient back to a functional life. But he utilized that person's particular belief systems. He could be very provocative and very direct. So one case was of a man in his 50s who was a Prussian German who had been very successful, very domineering, very intelligent, very achievement-oriented, and he had had a stroke. And as a result of that stroke, he hadn't been able to speak, he had hardly been able to move. He'd been bedridden, in a hospital pretty much for a year. And his wife took him to see Erikson, and Erikson, having learned about the man's background and his domineering tendencies and his achievements and his identity as a Prussian German at that particular time. This was probably in the 50s. Said to the wife, okay, I'm going to say a few things, but I need you to not interfere, not object, not save your husband. You won't understand it, you won't like it, but that's the deal. So as the guy was wheeled in, carried in, Erikson just relented this barrage where he called him a Nazi pig and told him that he was on the level of a criminally, mentally retarded Jew, and accused him of being a lazy charity case, and just delivered the worst insults imaginable, tailored for this particular person. And then said, well, the good thing is that I have, a whole night to think of new insults for you, and you will be back here tomorrow, and you don't really have a choice. And the guy, for the first time, he'd gotten so rageful, so angry, that he screamed, no, no, no. And he was able to crawl out of the room and out into the car. And the day after, his wife took him back to Erikson, and Erikson kind of became friends with him and had a friendly orientation where he said, look, I hope I don't have to do that again. Like, that I'm able to get you to speak. I hope I don't have to get you to have to be unpleasant to get you to do it. And from then on, they were able to work and get him gradually back to life, with language and movement and all sorts of stuff. But it's one of those things that if you just read and you can read about this case in Uncommon Therapy by Jay Haley. If you just read like the transcript of the case and what he's saying to that person, it sounds awful. Like it sounds demeaning and heartless and cruel, and something you'd probably be sued for, today, that a conventional therapist would never do. But Erikson had the wisdom, the intelligence, the compassion for people to be willing to do something like that, because he had the understanding that would be the best way to awaken that particular person to come back into life, so to speak. Very pragmatic orientation. Another case in terms of utilization and seeing the individual that I really like is his famous case dubbed the African Violet Queen of Milwaukee. And this was also a colleague of him, a medical doctor, who said, look, I have this aunt back in Wisconsin, because Erikson was going there to teach a seminar, and the colleague said, look, I'm really concerned for her. She's very wealthy, but she's completely isolated. She's horribly depressed. She has no friends. She doesn't get along with anyone else in the family outside of me. The only thing she does is that she goes to church, but she doesn't really talk to anyone. Will you please drop by her and see if you can do something for her? And this was probably more common back in the 40s or 50s or 60s, whenever this particular case was. So doctors had more prestige and authority in some sense. So Erikson went to her home, and the maid opened the door and contacted the woman, who was very depressed. And Erikson introduced himself and kind of demanded to be taken on a tour of the house, and was able to get rapport with her. And as he looked around in the house, he saw 3 African violets, and he saw this other pot, with this, what do you call it, lens or apparently African violets, take some a lot of work to cultivate. And he saw these potting pots. So Erikson right then and there knew how to help that particular woman. So he said to her, look, here's what I want you to do. And he probably did it in the Eriksonian, artistic way. he gave her the task of buying every African violet she could find, and a lot of these potting pots, and to really watch the newspaper, and to be very aware in the church, and that every time there was some sort of ritual, wedding, funeral, childbirth, uh, uh, whatever, she was to send one of these African violets to the person or family or couple involved. And when she died many years later, she had a very rich, meaningful social life. She was very well connected. She was very active. Um, Hundreds of people attended her funeral, and she was written about as the African Violet Queen of Milwaukee. Of course, Erikson realized that utilizing her interest in these flowers, and being part of the church, he used that as an opportunity to get her active, to get her engaged, to get her social, and so that's one of those beautiful cases. There's no childhood analysis. There's no pathological medicalizing of it's just cultivating, utilizing, meeting, guiding that particular individual in a way that really works for her. Um, he was very skilled at, once again, both with behavioral interventions in the world. Erikson seemed to uh, be very elegant in how he could move from working with someone's inner subjective experience and helping someone, do things out in the world. So the way he would do hypnosis as well, instead of a standardized inductions, he would try to evoke states, evoke primary process, evoke absorption and experiential learnings by meeting that particular person where they were, and to view hypnosis and hypnotic phenomena as learning tools. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this too. There was a woman who had asthma and who had been to several medical doctors. They tried their stuff back in the day. Nothing helped. And she was sent to Erikson with the suggestion that he might be able to help and that it might be psychosomatic. And she was really insulted by this, really offended by this, really convinced that this was a biological issue, as it had occurred after a cold. It only occurred in the winter, and she attributed it to the impurities in the air in the mining town that she was living in. But she was desperate enough to see Erikson, and Erikson talked with her and kind of got her history, and noticed that what had happened was that she had gone from a high of getting married to losing her mother that she loved a lot within the space of like 3 days. And the mother had promised her, as part of the inheritance, that when she died, the father was to sell the farm and share the whatever they got, 50-50 between the daughter and her father. And after she died, the father kind of went back on that, and said that he was going to still have the farm, but she could have a small annual kind of salary for it. And the father would work hard, from like May until July or whatever, and then essentially vacation the rest, and hire someone to do the rest of the stuff on the farm. And this was very stressful for the daughter. Now, during the summertime, the father didn't write because he was busy with the farm. But during the winter, he sent her weekly letters, and she only had asthma during the winter and never during the summer. So it would start up in, I think, November and last until May, and then she would be free of it. So she was completely convinced that it was biological. So Erikson did hypnosis with her, and she proved to be an excellent subject. And Erikson said to her, I'm going to give you the opportunity to discover whether this is psychosomatic or biological, this asthma that you have. And he discovered that he could evoke amnesia with her, and he trained her to respond to post-hypnotic suggestions. And he gave her the suggestion that when I tap my pencil 3 times, you're going to engage in this very specific memory task. You're going to respond fully. And he brought her back out of the hypnosis. And the date for this intervention was July 8th in a very sunny, hot Phoenix, Arizona. And of course, she didn't have any asthmatic symptoms. And he said to her, you know, it's the time is 2:17. At 2:37, you're going to have a violent asthmatic attack. You're going to discover that your asthma is psychosomatic. And she was like confused. It seemed like a preposterous idea. So they sat there, and of course this built expectancy, right? And when the time reached 2:37, when the time reached 2:37, Erikson tapped his pencil 3 times and said, now remember the content of any of the letters that your father has sent you and respond fully. And she had a violent asthmatic attack. And while she had it, and she was completely stunned by this, Erikson drove home the fact that it's July, it's Phoenix, Arizona, it's the middle of summer, you don't have a cold, there's no mining town here, there's no impurities in the air, but you're having a vicious asthmatic attack. And since it is psychosomatic, that also means that it can very easily go away. And when I drop my lighter into my ashtray, it's going to go away. You're going to go back into a deep hypnotic trance and come out of it. And he did. And this is, and then they had a conversation, and she went to her father, and she, you know, set some boundaries, and she was able to persuade him to actually sell the farm. And Erikson had follow-up for years, and she never had an asthmatic attack again. This is a great example of how Erikson would use hypnosis. Instead of just barking out suggestions, he would use it in kind of artistic, dramatic ways to help someone to have a change in perspective, or a particular insight, or to cultivate a particular skill. Now, he was able to do this very well with or without any formal, with or without any formal hypnosis. A bit like if you could only grow your feet large enough for a man to see them, you know, where the implication is you have small feet. Now, there's a world of difference between just saying to someone you have small feet, or just saying to someone that your asthma is psychosomatic, or just being able to orchestrate a learning context where someone in a kind of dramatic, experiential way can make a discovery or reorganize their experience, have an insight, or reframe something. I think this was the big artistry of Erikson. He was also very skilled in using indirect suggestion. So, for example, He writes about these cases of women who have, delayed menstrual periods, where he would be quite skilled in helping them activate their period just by asking them seemingly very innocent questions about what happens in their body and how they feel. And he would ask these questions in such a way that it would evoke the memories and the body learnings, and then the mind-body system would respond by producing, a period or whatever experience they may have had. There's a famous case of a child who's wetting the bed, who's very much into baseball, and his older brother is into football, and Erikson works with him, and they only mention dry beds or the lack of dry beds once. The rest of the time, Erikson talks with him about baseball and how you need to use the right muscles in the right way, and you contract this and you release that, and offered a lot of suggestions around that, which the kid unconsciously related to the bedwetting issue. But they never directly talked about the bedwetting issue. It was clear that that was the context. Another guy who had cancer, where Erikson was asked by a physician to come in and see if he could help this old guy have some relief. His name was Joe. He was a florist. Erikson sat down and talked to him and began talking a lot about tomato plants. And in describing tomato plants and talking about farming and stuff like that, he would lean on words of comfort and peace and one day at a time and regaining strength. And he would call it the interspersal technique, where he would lean on certain words, certain phrases, embed them within stories, and he helped Joe develop a very deep hypnotic experience where he had drastically reduced levels of pain and more mastery. But no one around him really saw that or recognized that as a hypnotic intervention. So that sort of indirectness was a very unique thing with Erikson. I want to share a final case here, which is from the book My Voice Will Go With You, which is a great book. It's called Vicious Pleasure. And this is, you could kind of argue, is this hypnosis? Is it not hypnosis? I think it's a great example of how he, once again, met a client where the client is, uses utilization, uses storytelling, uses drama, is able to create a context where someone can then have a new perspective, which is useful for them. So I'll just read this. It's called Vicious Pleasure. A woman in her 30s arrived and said, "I don't suppose you want to see me." I said, "That's your supposition. Would you like to hear mine?" "Well," she said, "I'm not deserving of your attention. When I was 6 years old, my father molested me sexually, and from the age of 6 until 17, he used me as a sexual object, regularly, several times a week. And every time he did it, I was in a state of fear. I was frozen with terror. I felt dirty, inferior, inadequate, ashamed. I thought at 17 I had enough strength to break away from him and work my way through the rest of high school, hoping that that would give me a feeling of self-respect. And it didn't. Then I thought maybe a Bachelor of Arts degree would give me a feeling of self-respect. I worked my way through college. I felt ashamed, inferior, indecent. It was a terrible feeling of disappointment. I thought maybe a master's degree would give me self-respect, but it didn't. And all through college and graduate school, I was propositioned, and that proved I didn't deserve self-respect. I thought I would enroll for a doctorate degree, and men kept propositioning me. I just gave up and became a common prostitute, but that's not very nice. And some man offered to let me live with him. Well, a girl needs to have food and shelter, so I agreed to it. Sex was a horrible experience. A penis is so hard and looks so threatening. I just became fear-stricken and passive, and it was a painful, horrible experience. This man got tired of me, and I began living with another man. The same thing over and over, and now I come to you. I feel like filth. An erect penis just terrifies me, and I just get helpless and weak and passive. I'm so glad when a man finishes. But I still have to live, I have to have clothes, I have to have shelter, and essentially I'm not worth anything else. Now before we go on here, think about how a regular therapist would be likely to work with this particular client. So this is a one-session solution. So Erikson said, I said, that's an unhappy story. And the really unhappy part is you're stupid. You tell me that you're afraid of a bold, erect, hard penis, and that's stupid. You know you have a vagina. I know it. A vagina can take the biggest, boldest, most assertive penis and turn it into a dangling, helpless object. And your vagina can take vicious pleasure in reducing it to a helpless, dangling object. The change on her face was wonderful. She said, I'm going to go back to Los Angeles. Can I see you in a month's time? And I said, certainly. She came back in a month's time and said, you're right. I went to bed with a man and I took a vicious pleasure in reducing him to helplessness. It didn't take long and I enjoyed it. And I tried another man, the same thing, and another man, and it's pleasurable. Now I'm going to get my PhD and go into counseling, and I'm going to wait until I see a man I can live with. I called her stupid. I really got her attention. And then I said, vicious pleasure. And she did resent men. And I also said, pleasure. Now notice how he's, in one dramatic moment, helping her to reframe her own experience and to get a different perspective. And he utilizes her sense of stupidity and also the fact that she really did resent men at the time, the vicious, and also pleasure. So I really like that case. I really recommend that you read that book. My Voice Will Go With You by Sidney Rosen. Uncommon Therapy by Jay Haley is also a very good one. Phoenix by David Gordon is an excellent book. I also really like Hypnotherapy by Erikson and Rossi. So that should put you on. Now, as for the weaknesses, what I perceive to be some weaknesses, and what I have kept and what I've kind of left behind, as a student. One thing you will notice if you read the Ericksonian literature is that he doesn't really seem to admit to many failures. You get the success stories, and even the ones who aren't quite successful are kind of cases he reframes as successful in the end, or at least partially not successful. He must have failed. He must have had many clients who didn't get anywhere with him, but you don't quite hear of those. And I think that's a weakness in Erikson's teaching and some of the culture around Erikson and his students. I think it's really important to be able to admit to failures and failed cases and what you learn from them. There's many instances of people describing Erikson not quite succeeding with clients, and also not succeeding in evoking hypnotic phenomena. Herbert Spiegel, for example, writes about, they used to have this friendly combat because Erikson would claim that everyone was hypnotizable, and Spiegel would claim that people have vary a lot in their hypnotic capacity, and Erikson would attempt to do hypnosis with this person who Spiegel had deemed to be unhypnotizable, and got nowhere. There's many of these sorts of cases. If you watch, there's I think you can find it on YouTube. It's called a reverse set induction. Erikson does hypnosis with this woman called Ruth. I don't think it's impressive at all. I don't really think there's much hypnosis happening there. I think Erikson's kind of lost as to what to do with her. Ruth had been the secretary of Ernest Hilgard, and who else? Well, some other name who escapes me at the moment, and had scored like very low on like the Stanford scales. So there's many examples of students and others who talk about Erikson not necessarily getting anywhere with a patient, and I think Erikson and the rest of us would have been better off if he could have been more straightforward with that. Another kind of weakness, I think, Erikson was a very intelligent guy. He had a lot of wisdom about human beings, and he had tremendous observational skills, like just observational skills that were unheard of. So, legend has it that he had polio, and for a year he could only move his eyes. So he was constricted to only observing, and he had 7 sisters when he was 17 and had polio, and he would train himself to notice who came to the house, based upon the rhythm of how they walked and what kind of states they were in, and what he could predict. He did experiments from a very early age, and there's all these stories of him being able to pick up the most, there's this case of this woman who walks in, and she crosses her ankles in a particular way, and she says that she has fear of flying, and that her husband is going to take her abroad, and she's scared. And Erikson says, "Would you mind going out and coming back in again?" And she sits down in the same way, and he says to her, "Now, I have a question for you. You're not going to like it. Does your husband know about your affair?" And she said, "No, but how do you know?" And apparently, according to people who write cases and Erikson students, he had this ability to read people. Like he would say to someone, you were clearly the second child in a family. You weren't your mother's favorite, but you were your grandmother's favorite. He would be able to notice who had done prison time or not, just based upon how they walked into a room. Apparently, he could know whether his secretary had her period or not based upon her typing speed. How he know that? Don't even ask me. But he was really astute in picking up. So he did a hypnosis demonstration at I think a medical conference with this medical doctor, and she didn't seem to respond that well. And then Erikson took this piece of paper, turned it into like a cylinder, put his finger into it, and kind of let the whole thing drop to the floor and seemed to lose all interest in it. And after that, she responded really well. And Jeffrey Zeig had the opportunity to ask him later, like, what was going on with that? And she said, well, I noticed the last time I saw her, she had a wedding ring. And I just intuited that she was kind of inhibited, that something around, and she no longer had a wedding ring, right? So something along that might come up in the hypnosis. So by non-verbally doing those things, he kind of indirectly communicated that he knew about it and didn't care about it, and her inhibitions disappeared. So that level of being able to pick things up. He also had a bunch of handicaps that he utilized the strength. So he had polio, he was dyslexic, he was tone deaf, he was colorblind. He had a lot of experience in overcoming pain. So The rest of us don't really have that level of intelligence, that level of observational skill. And I think one kind of weakness in his teachings is that when I read it, it's a bit like, well, how do I do that? Or how did he get there? Or how do you do this stuff if you're not Erikson? And I think there's a lot of emphasis on language and implications and indirect hypnotic suggestions. And like if you read The February Man, for example, a particular case, that book is like written 30 years after the actual case. And Erikson presents these kind of complex, sophisticated things that he did and makes all these inferences. And I think it's kind of unlikely. And I remember reading Herbert Spiegel wrote about this. This guy who had seen Spiegel 5 times to stop smoking, like, and nothing happened, and Spiegel just wanted to sink through the floor of his office, right? Like, not that client again, but then that particular client was going to go to Phoenix, Arizona. So he kind of said, look, I have a colleague down there who's quite good. Would you drop in and see him? And he phoned Erikson, and they had this kind of combative, collegial, and Erikson was happy to see him, and Erikson saw him once, and he stopped smoking, and he came back, and Spiegel was like delighted, but simultaneously frustrated, and he called the guy in and said, well, why did you stop with Erikson and not with me? And did he do anything in particular? And what was he said, no, it was pretty much the same stuff that you did, why with him and not with me? And he said, well, there was something about just seeing that old guy who no longer had the use of his legs in a wheelchair so intently, ferociously trying to save mine. It just got to me in a different way. And I wonder when I read many of these case stories, because you never hear explanations and interpretations like that, how much of it might just have been Erikson the person, his humanity, his presence, his way of connecting with people, perhaps more than the particular skills. He also, there's a biography of Erikson which is quite good, called An American Healer, written by Bradford Keeney and one of his daughters, Betty Alice Erikson. And one of his daughters there writes about this episode where she's home visiting with her son, and Erikson had a very modest office. He didn't seem to care about money or materialistic things. Pretty much his patients would interact with his family, and it was all very, and she was used to that. And Erikson said to her, he was walking with a cane at the time, and he said to her, don't let your son come anywhere near the next patient. And the daughter was like, why not? Like, and Erikson had just, in an irritated way, said, because I said so. And she kind of objected to that and couldn't understand it and said, well, I want to know why. And Erikson had just turned to her and looked at her. And she got the most instinctive surge of fear she had ever had, and had instinctively grabbed around her son and held him for dear life. And then he just said, that's why. And of course she never let her son go anywhere near that patient. And later when she saw the patient come out, the son was in the house, and she didn't observe anything that, but she asked her father, what the hell was that, and what did you do? And he just said, well, if you have to ask, I can't explain it. So what the hell was that? Erikson did not believe in any psychic or overnatural phenomena. He was not a mystic. He was not he attributed everything to like natural phenomena. Other weaknesses, I think. One thing I took from the teachings was a strong emphasis on indirect communication. Um, I kind of left that behind. Um, I never found indirect approaches to hypnosis to be really more effective than direct approaches to hypnosis for the most part. I also got a bit stuck as a student in this idea that you have to like tailor a unique intervention to every client. What I discovered for me over time, I do way more like psychoeducation. I guide people through thought experiments and I adapt what I do to the person to some extent, obviously. But I've discovered that you can with, for example, anxious clients for the most part do the same things because there's the same psychological illusions, there's the same misunderstandings at play. So and something else that Erikson kind of had this idea that everyone was hypnotizable. The hypnosis research seems to suggest that that's not the case, that hypnotic capacity is even more stable than IQ if you test and retest over a 25-year period. People may learn how to use whatever the capacity they have more better, but I agree with that research. I've never seen someone go from a non-hypnotizable or low hypnotizable into becoming like a highly hypnotizable. I just haven't seen it. And I haven't seen it in the work of the people who claim that to be the case either. And I found, I of course no longer so much use a hypnosis frame anyways, but when I did, I found more leverage in trying to adapt interventions to the hypnotic capacities that the client had versus trying to do hypnosis with everyone for the most part. Uh, Something else I really got from studying the work of Herbert and David Spiegel was that there are a lot of pitfalls with highly hypnotizable clients. One of them being, for example, they're so great at getting absorbed into new suggested experiences that it can very often be very easy come, easy go. They end up in a new context. They can often just as easily get reabsorbed into that and undo everything you've done together. So Erikson never mentioned that. He never cautioned against some of the pitfalls with these highly hypnotizable clients and how you can get around them. So another thing is that Erikson would present the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. You could almost get the feeling that there's this entity called the unconscious mind that you can communicate with and that you can. I I've dropped using uh, such a framework. I've never found it useful. I've stopped using ideomotor signaling, this idea that you can contact the unconscious mind. I've completely stopped doing it. I realize, of course, that we can know a lot of things that we don't really know, that most of our activity is happening, under the surface, so to speak, that you can do multi-level communication, that people can be reached without quite knowing that they're reached. But I don't think you need to presuppose these kind of entity like conscious and unconscious minds and attribute to them all these characteristics. This idea that you need to bypass the so-called conscious mind to get to the unconscious mind. Uh, I've completely stopped using those frames. You can easily, as a student, get this idea that you're kind of a technician who's going to indirectly influence this thing like unconscious mind in a client. Uh, there's also this idea. Erikson always emphasizes how the unconscious mind of the client is so intelligent and has the solutions, but he never quite uh, does a good job in explaining why the person's unconscious mind is behaving so wacky before they come into Erikson's office. You know, clearly there has to be something about the relationship between Erikson and the client, the learning context, the relationship between them where new resources and new perspectives emerge. And I think it's a mistake to attribute all of that to the intelligence of the client's unconscious mind. Um, I Erikson, I also think Erikson was, on the one hand, quite clear that it's the client that does the job. However, when you read many of the case studies, it also seems like, well, he had this expression himself that he had an iron fist, in a velvet glove. That this idea that the therapist is supposed to be in control of the session, or that the therapist is kind of making the change happen. You see all these cases where he kind of accepts challenges from clients that he's going to hypnotize them and prove that they're in a trance. And I also found that sort of perspective not very useful. Um, for me, and these are my tastes, but for me, when I see a client, it's this learning context where I offer things, I guide people through experiments, but I'm very clear that they are the one. It's what they hear, it's what they do, it's what they reorganize. The changes are essentially up to them. Um, he also had like a very atheoretical, non-philosophical, no framework type orientation, even though he obviously had some guiding principles. I think as a student, it can be very confusing to try to learn from Erikson's work without having any structure whatsoever. And I think if you look at schools like metacognitive therapy, or the more cognitive therapy like REBT, for example, that really helps people relate to their thoughts and feelings differently, make discoveries about how thought works, um, and sometimes can help people to think better, to think more critically. More of that psychoeducational approach can be very useful, and Erikson didn't seem to really emphasize that. Although you could make an argument that with his hypnotic and behavioral interventions, he was kind of doing that without necessarily talking about it, in that sense. So, one more plus and a minus. Uh, Erikson was a prestigious psychiatrist who had his office in a modest home, small home, where his family would interact with his clients, and he he seems to be an anti-snob. His rates were somewhat lower actually than what was common. So he said, for example, at one time he charged $4 for an hour, and there were 10 students, and he was like, well, no, it's still $4 for an hour. So he seemed to be, you know, I'm a capitalist. I have no objections to anyone charging or earning good money. I don't like greed. Erikson did not seem greedy. He did not seem driven by money or driven by material possessions at all. He seemed to be genuinely interested in human beings and their lives. Um, there is this idea in the coaching world, right, that you get what you pay for, and it's the people who charge an arm and a leg, and if you don't do that, you don't respect the profession. I think Erikson is a good counterexample to that culture. Of course, for some bizarre reason, they tried to take his medical license away so many times. His colleagues often didn't quite listen to him. But despite that, he still wanted hypnosis to be something that only he and his colleagues could do. I think that's kind of a weakness. So, anyways, I hope you found my take useful, inspiring. I'd love to hear your comments, to what extent you agree, disagree, or have found something different. Remember, these are strengths and limitations according to me. So, if you like my approach and you'd like to do some change work, do some mentoring, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.